It's the year 1967. You're a young child living in Southern California, excited that you're going to Disneyland for the very first time in your short life. In particular, you're really looking forward to experiencing a brand new ride called Pirates of the Caribbean. This is a classic dark ride that's located at many Disney parks worldwide. This was the very last ride in which Walt Disney himself participated in the creation of, dying shortly thereafter. Rest in peace. The ride you're so excited to get on is located in the New Orleans Square portion of Disneyland. As you're walking there with your family, you're envisioning all the wondrous things you might see. Pirates of the Caribbean utilizes 630,000 gallons of water, 53 different audio animatronic animals and birds, and 75 animatronic pirates and villagers. Within that complicated ride system, there are many different skeletons used as props. Through your child's eyes, these look particularly convincing. However, props weren't exactly known for being especially high quality in the 1960s. And yet, to your young mind, they looked just like real skeletons. Well, that's because they were. You see, hoping to avoid the unconvincing look of the 1960s fakes, Disneyland's notorious perfectionist Imagineers procured genuine human remains from the nearby UCLA Medical Center. Over time, of course, these were all removed as more and more convincing props were created, until eventually no real remains were left. However, for that little child way back in 1967, they had no idea they were staring at genuine human corpses. That kind of brings a new meaning to the phrase, dead men tell no tales, now doesn't it?
The inside for clothes that twist and lock. Bold 3 detergent plus fabric softener. Spray relief. You two take care of labor. Only intended for plain capsule. You don't want to die of cold. Toll free.
Most of us try not to think about dying and subsequently being buried. It's not really a very comforting thought, now is it? Personally, I feel claustrophobic just thinking about that tiny, suffocating space. Luckily for us though, we were born in the modern era, with all that implies, including access to at least somewhat decent medical care. Chances are, we're not going in that box unless we're truly good and gone, but this hasn't always been the case. In particular, things were very different in 17th century England. A woman named Alice Blunden is one such example. After drinking an excessive amount of sedatives, a doctor mistakenly pronounced her dead. She was then accidentally buried alive. Horrifically, this ordeal didn't just happen to Alice once, but twice. After exhuming Alice's body, they discovered that she was indeed still alive, but was very close to death now, and so they decided to bury her again. However, Alice continued to struggle in her casket before finally and mercifully succumbing to death. This incident, and ones like it, led to the creation of so-called safety coffins. These allowed the occupant to signal to people on the surface that they'd been buried alive. One common method of this was a string which was attached to a bell fastened to the gravestone. This allowed the person in the coffin to pull the string and alert anyone nearby on the surface. I don't know about you, but things like this make me very grateful to have been born in the modern age.
I'll give you trouble. Pop your piece around the track if you get nails and more nails. Just right up here. Don't be shy.
The Wild Wild West. Quite the unique period in American history. Elmer McCurdy was an outlaw, known as the bandit who wouldn't give up. Elmer was eventually killed by police in a shootout after robbing a train in Oklahoma. Quite bizarrely, his corpse would end up being embalmed and put on display in a local funeral home. Elmer was dressed in street clothes, and a rifle was placed into his hands. For only a nickel, the owner of the funeral home allowed guests to view the body of the notorious bandit. This macabre exhibit would be a hit and eventually attract the attention of carnival promoters. However, the owner of the funeral home refused to sell his gruesome possession. But in October of the year 1916, a man calling himself Aver contacted the owner, claiming to be Elmer's long-lost brother from California. This supposed Aver took possession of the body, assuring the owner of the funeral home that it would be shipped back to San Francisco for a proper burial. However, the corpse was actually sent to Arkansas City, Kansas. The man who claimed to be Elmer's sibling was in reality a man named James Patterson, who, alongside his brother Charles, was the former owner of a traveling circus. It wouldn't be long then before McCurdy's body would be featured in James's carnival as the outlaw who would never be captured alive. This exhibit would also be a success, but in the year 1922, James sold his whole operation to a man called Louis Sonny. Sonny utilized Elmer's corpse in his so-called Museum of Crime, which also featured replicas of other famous bandits. The corpse would go on to change hands many times over the years, eventually becoming completely mummified. In the year 1964, a filmmaker and writer named David Freeman was in possession of the body, and this resulted in a brief appearance of Elmer in the film She Freak. In 1968, the body, along with various wax figures, was sold to Spoonie Singh for $10,000. Singh was the owner of the Hollywood Wax Museum. By the year 1976, the knowledge that Elmer's body was an actual human corpse and not just another wax figure had faded from human consciousness, and this resulted in Elmer being part of the production of a television series known as The $6 Million Man. However, during the shoot, a prop man moved what he thought to be just a wax mannequin, resulting in Elmer's arm completely breaking off and revealing human bone and muscle tissue within. Obviously, the police were called, and Elmer was taken to the local coroner's office for a long overdue second autopsy. By this point, the body was completely petrified, with wax and many layers of phosphorus paint covering it. Eventually, Elmer's true identity was rediscovered, and on April 22, 1977, a funeral procession was conducted to transport Elmer to the Boot Hill section of Summit View Cemetery in Guthrie, Oklahoma. So, what can we learn from this whole saga? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I am a bit resentful that Elmer had a more exciting death than I've had a life. Floods. When you hear this word, you almost certainly think of great volumes of water rushing over the landscape. However, this is not always the case. On the 17th of October, 1814, an event took place in the city of London that would go on to become one of its darkest tragedies ever. This incident began as an awful accident at Mew & Co.'s Horseshoe Brewery. This facility contained 22-foot-tall wooden vats of fermenting porter. At around 4:30 p.m. on the afternoon of the 17th, George Crick, the storehouse clerk, noticed that one of the 700-pound iron bands around the vat had slipped. The vat in question was filled to the brim with over 3,000 barrels of 10-month-old porter. However, since the iron band slipping was a rather common occurrence, Mr. Crick was unconcerned. Ultimately, Crick was advised by his superior to leave a note for the owner of the brewery concerning the issue, and then he went about his day. About an hour after the ring had first slipped off, Mr. Crick was standing on a raised platform some 30 feet away from the vat when, with no further warning or indication, the vat burst. The force from the released liquid was so great that it instantly knocked the stop from a neighboring vat, which also began spilling its contents. Several more hogsheads were utterly destroyed, with this only adding to the flood. The force of this rushing liquid was so great, in fact, that it completely destroyed the far wall of the building. This sent a wave of porter 15 feet high sweeping out onto New Street, where it outright destroyed 2 homes and damaged 2 others. Tragically, within one of those homes, a 4-year-old girl was killed after being swept out onto the street by the surging liquid. And quite unfortunately, a wake was being held in the other home that was destroyed at the time of the flood, and this resulted in the deaths of 5 separate mourners, including the mother of the child whose wake it was. Sadly, a 14-year-old girl was the first to die, after she was crushed by the collapsing wall of the brewery. And this was followed by finding yet another child dead in a house on New Street. However, all those working within the brewery, including Mr. Crick, luckily survived. Following this tragic event, the area surrounding the business was utterly decimated, with some even describing it as being equal to the damage caused by a great fire or earthquake. Somewhat controversially, a coroner's inquest would reach a verdict of the event being a so-called act of God, and so therefore the company was not liable for any compensation. The brewery went back into business shortly thereafter, but would go on to close in 1921 when they moved their production to the 9 Elms Brewery in Wandsworth. As a direct result of this horrible accident, large wooden vats have been phased out across the entire brewing industry in favor of lined concrete vessels. You know, when thinking about alcohol-related deaths, a flood isn't really the first thing that jumps to mind. But that just goes to show, it's best to stay away from it entirely. Thank you all for watching Cancel Happiness, and just know, if you're unhappy, then you're not alone. In fact, you're at home.